The night a seeker realized nothing truly belongs to him. A journey into letting go sleep content script. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a seeker who spent his entire life gathering possessions, relationships, achievements, memories, building an empire of belongings around himself like walls of a fortress. But on one extraordinary night, as he sat alone in his chamber surrounded by everything he owned, a profound realization washed over him like a gentle wave eroding ancient stone. One by one, he examined everything he thought was his, and with each examination, his grip loosened. By dawn, he owned nothing, and in owning nothing, he discovered he had everything. This is the story of that night. A night that changed everything by revealing that nothing was ever truly his to begin with. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this journey carry you into peaceful sleep. Part 1. The Seeker's World. Our story begins in a time that exists both everywhere and nowhere, in a land that could be any land, with a man who could be any one of us. Let us call him the Seeker, for that is what he had been all his life. A seeker of things, of experiences, of meaning, of more. The Seeker lived in a beautiful home that sat atop a gentle hill overlooking a valley where morning mists gathered like thoughts before they take form. His home was filled with treasures collected over decades of searching. Rare books lined mahogany shelves that reached toward high ceilings. Paintings from distant lands adorned walls painted in rich, warm colors. Sculptures stood in corners like silent witnesses to his success. Carpets from ancient weaving traditions cushioned his every step. Each object had a story, a price, a significance. In his chambers, wardrobes overflowed with fine clothes made from silks and wools, cottons and linens. Drawers contained jewelry passed down through generations. Watches that marked the passage of time with mechanical precision, cufflinks and ornaments that spoke of refinement and status. His desk held instruments of writing, fountain pens from Italy, leather journals from Florence, papers of various weights and textures. Everything suggested a life well lived, a person of substance and accomplishment. But that is only what the eye could see. The Seeker had also accumulated less tangible possessions. He had a position in society, a reputation that preceded him into rooms before his physical body arrived. People knew his name, spoke it with respect or envy or admiration. He had credentials, degrees from prestigious institutions, certifications of expertise, awards that testified to his excellence in various fields. His resume was a long scroll of achievements, each line a conquest, each bullet point a victory over circumstance. The Seeker had relationships too, which he counted among his possessions without quite realizing that this was what he was doing. He had a wife, though they had grown distant over years of his seeking. He had children, now adults, scattered across the world pursuing their own seeking. He had friends, colleagues, acquaintances, a network of connections that he maintained with the same careful attention he gave to his investment portfolio. Each relationship served a purpose, filled a need, confirmed an aspect of his identity. He had memories, thousands upon thousands of them, stored in the vast library of his mind. Memories of childhood adventures and adolescent heartbreaks, of early successes and devastating failures, of travels to exotic places and quiet moments of unexpected beauty. These memories were treasures he would take out and examine on quiet evenings, polishing them with nostalgia until they shone brighter than perhaps they had any right to shine. And yet, despite all this abundance, despite this empire of possession and achievement, the Seeker felt an emptiness growing inside him like a dark seed sprouting in fertile soil. It had started small, this emptiness barely noticeable, just a slight dissatisfaction, a wondering if this was all there was. But over time, it had grown. No matter what he acquired, the emptiness seemed to expand to accommodate it, like a cosmic void that no amount of matter could fill. He had tried to fill it with more possessions, purchased with increasing urgency, more experiences sought with desperate intensity, more achievements pursued with relentless drive, more relationships collected like rare coins. But the more he gathered, the emptier he felt. It was a paradox that tormented him during sleepless nights when the house was quiet and his thoughts were loud. On this particular night, the night that would change everything, the Seeker found himself unable to sleep once again. The clock beside his bed marked the passage of hours with soft, electronic precision. Midnight had come and gone. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. His wife slept peacefully beside him, but sleep eluded him as it had so many nights before. Finally, giving up on rest, he rose from his bed and walked through his home, a ghost in his own castle. His bare feet made no sound on the expensive carpets. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. He wandered from room to room, looking at all the things he had gathered, and a question began to form in his mind. A simple question that would unravel everything. "What do I actually own?" he whispered to the silence. At first, the answer seemed obvious. He owned everything around him. This house, these possessions, this life he had built. But as he stood in his study, surrounded by shelves of books he had purchased but would never read again, something shifted inside him. A small crack appeared in his certainty, and through that crack, a light began to shine. A light that would illuminate a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. He sat down in his leather chair, the one that had conformed to his body over years of use, and decided to examine this question with the same rigorous attention he had given to business problems and intellectual pursuits throughout his life. What did he truly own? He would go through everything one by one and determine what was genuinely, permanently his. The night stretched before him like an open road, and he was finally ready to travel it to its end. He had no idea that this journey would take him further than any of his travels to distant lands had ever done. He had no idea that by dawn, everything would be different. He only knew that he needed answers, and he was willing to sit with the questions until those answers came. And so, as the clock marked the deep hours of the night, the seeker began his final seeking. Not a search for more, but a search for what was real, for what could truly be said to belong to him. This search would strip him of everything he thought he owned, and in that stripping away, would give him a gift beyond all the treasures he had ever accumulated. The first thing he decided to examine was the most obvious, the most visible, the most tangible, his material possessions. He looked around his study at the mahogany desk, the leather chair, the walls of books, the art, the oriental rug beneath his feet. These were his, weren't they? He had purchased them. He had legal documents proving ownership. His name was on deeds and receipts. Surely these belonged to him. But as he sat there in the moonlight, preparing to examine this assumption, a memory surfaced from earlier that day. He had walked past an antique shop and seen in the window a chair very similar to one his grandfather had owned. For a moment, he had been transported back to childhood, sitting in his grandfather's study, listening to stories, feeling safe and loved. But his grandfather was gone now, had been gone for decades. And that chair his grandfather had owned? The seeker had no idea where it was now. Perhaps in another antique shop, perhaps in a landfill, perhaps in someone else's home. His grandfather had owned that chair once, just as the seeker owned his chair now. But where was that ownership now? It had dissolved like morning mist when exposed to the sun of time. The chair had passed on to other hands or to decay, and his grandfather's ownership of it was now just a memory, insubstantial as smoke. The realization sent a small shiver through the seeker's body. He looked at the objects around him with new eyes. Part 2. The first possession, material wealth. The seeker rose from his chair and walked to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes. Each book represented not just money spent, but time invested, knowledge acquired, a piece of himself. Or so he had thought. He pulled out a first edition of a classic novel, one he had paid a considerable sum to acquire at an auction. The book felt heavy in his hands, substantial. It was his, the receipt said so, the provenance was clear. But was it really? He opened the cover and saw the names of previous owners inscribed in fading ink. This book had been published over 100 years ago. It had passed through many hands, had been owned by people now long dead. Each of them had thought of it as theirs. Each had possessed it with the same certainty he now felt. And where were they now? Gone. Dust. And the book remained, indifferent to its owners, ready to pass on to yet another person who would claim possession. The seeker carefully replaced the book on the shelf and moved to his desk. Here sat objects of even more personal significance. A pen his father had given him on his graduation day. A paperweight carved from jade, purchased on his honeymoon. A letter opener, a gift from a mentor long retired. These were his, surely? They were intimately connected to moments that defined his life. But again, that insidious question whispered through his mind. For how long? When he died, where would these objects go? To his children, perhaps, who would keep them for a while out of sentiment before they too passed them on, sold them, or discarded them. Or perhaps these objects would end up in estate sales, where strangers would pick them up, examine them, and decide whether they were worth purchasing, completely unaware of the significance they once held. The truth began to settle over him like a gentle weight. He didn't own these objects. He was merely their temporary custodian. They had existed before him and would exist after him. His ownership was an illusion, a legal fiction, a story he told himself about a relationship that was, in truth, very different from what he had imagined. He thought about his house, this beautiful structure that he had purchased with decades of hard work. He had mortgage documents that proved it was his. But even setting aside the fact that the bank technically owned a portion of it, what did that ownership really mean? The land this house sat on had been here for millions of years before humans even existed. It had belonged to forests, to indigenous peoples, to various owners throughout history. It would be here long after he was gone, after the house itself had crumbled, after his name was forgotten. How could he claim to own something so ancient, so enduring, when he was so temporary, so fleeting? The seeker walked through his home, looking at each room with this new perspective. The kitchen with its expensive appliances, all destined for obsolescence and replacement. The artwork on the walls, already on a journey from one collection to another. His ownership merely a brief stop on an endless journey. The furniture, the fixtures, the decorations. All of it temporary, all of it passing through his hands like water through a sieve. He opened closets and drawers, examining clothes and accessories. That suit he had worn to important meetings, making him feel powerful and successful. It was already slightly out of fashion, destined for a donation bin or the back of a closet, eventually to disintegrate into its component fibers. Those shoes that had carried him through important days, already showing signs of wear, eventually to be discarded and replaced. The watch on his wrist that told him what time it was, a marvel of engineering that would eventually fail, its tiny gears grinding to a halt, or simply become obsolete in a world that had moved on to new technologies. Each object told the same story, temporary possession masquerading as permanent ownership. He was like a child on a beach, gathering shells and declaring them his, not realizing that the tide would eventually wash everything away. But it wasn't just the inevitability of loss that struck him. It was something more profound. Even in this moment, even as he held these objects and looked at them and used them, did he truly possess them? A book sits on a shelf whether he owns it or not. The atoms that comprise it exist independent of any claim of ownership. His relationship to it was one of proximity and legal right, not of true possession. He could use it, look at it, even destroy it, but could he really be said to own it in any fundamental sense? The seeker sat down on his expensive couch, sinking into cushions that had cost more than some people earned in months, and laughed softly at the absurdity of it all. He had spent decades accumulating wealth specifically to purchase things he could claim as his own. He had worked long hours, sacrificed time with family, stressed over deals and investments, all to expand his domain of ownership. And now, in the quiet of this night, he was seeing that ownership itself was a kind of shared delusion, a game humans played to create a sense of security in an impermanent world. This realization didn't make him sad. Exactly. It was more complex than that. There was a lightness to it, as if a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. If he didn't truly own these things, then he couldn't truly lose them either. They were already in the process of leaving him, had always been leaving him, from the moment he acquired them. Ownership was just a story, and he could choose to believe that story or not. He thought of all the energy he had devoted to protecting his possessions, insuring them, maintaining them, worrying about them. The anxiety he felt when something broke or was damaged. The grief when something was lost. All of that emotional investment in things that were, in truth, just passing through his life like clouds passing through the sky. What would it mean to live without that false sense of ownership? To appreciate things while they were present without claiming them as his. To use them, enjoy them, but hold them lightly, knowing that they came from a world that existed before him and would exist after him, that they were on their own journey and he was fortunate to intersect with them for a time. The seeker stood and walked to a window, looking out at his property, at the gardens he had so carefully cultivated, at the trees he had planted, at the land he ostensibly owned. But the trees were already older than his ownership of them. They would likely outlive him. The land had its own history, its own existence independent of his claims upon it. Even the garden, which seemed most personally his because he had designed it and tended it, was really a collaboration with nature, with sun and rain and soil and seed. He was a participant, not an owner. He realized that what he had actually been owning was not the objects themselves, but the relationship he had with them, the stories he told about them, the meaning he assigned to them. And those stories, those meanings, they existed only in his mind. They were his creation, yes, but they weren't the objects themselves. The gulf between the thing and his story about the thing suddenly seemed vast and unbridgeable. And if his ownership was really just a story, just a construction of his mind, then it could be released as easily as changing a thought. He didn't need to renounce his possessions, didn't need to give everything away or live as an ascetic. He could continue to use these things, care for them, appreciate them, but he could do so without the burden of ownership, without the grasping, without the fear of loss. As this understanding deepened, the seeker felt something inside him relax. His material possessions, his first and most obvious category of ownership, had been examined and found to be not his, not in any permanent, fundamental way. He was their steward, their temporary companion, but not their owner. And this realization, rather than impoverishing him, made him feel strangely rich, because if he didn't own them, he also couldn't lose them. They were already free, and so was he. Part 3. The second possession, relationships and love. Having examined his material possessions and found them to be illusory property, the seeker turned his attention to something more precious, more central to his sense of identity. His relationships. Surely here, in the realm of human connection, there was something he could truly claim as his own. He had a wife, children, friends, colleagues. These were his people, his relationships, his connections. They belonged to his life in a way that felt more fundamental than any material object. But even as he formed this thought, he felt the same questioning presence that had dismantled his claim to material ownership. Did these people belong to him? Could one person ever truly possess another? He thought of his wife, sleeping peacefully in the bedroom they shared. They had been married for 32 years. She wore his ring, bore his name in the tradition they had followed. In many ways, society recognized her as his wife, as belonging to him in some sense. But was that true? Did she belong to him? The seeker remembered their early days together, when love was fresh and consuming. He had felt then that they belonged to each other, that they were completing something incomplete, merging into a single unit. But over the years, as the initial passion settled into something quieter, he had begun to see her more clearly as a separate person, with her own inner life, her own desires and fears, her own mystery that he could never fully penetrate or possess. There had been times when he tried to possess her more completely, to know all her thoughts, to shape her decisions, to keep her within the boundaries of what he understood and could control. Those had been their most difficult times. She had resisted, as any person with integrity must resist being possessed by another. And he had suffered from the impossibility of owning her thoughts, her feelings, her essential self. The truth was, she was sovereign. She was her own person, living her own life. She had chosen to share that life with him, to intertwine her journey with his. But she was not his possession. She could not be owned any more than the wind could be captured in a jar. Every morning she woke up and chose, consciously or unconsciously, to continue in this relationship. Every day was a renewal of that choice, not an obligation enforced by his claim of ownership. And what about when one of them died? If she died first, would she cease to be his wife? In legal terms, yes, but in his heart, she would continue to exist as memory, as influence, as a shaping force in who he had become. And if he died first, she would continue her life, would grieve and eventually heal, would perhaps find new love, new connections. His ownership of the relationship would dissolve completely because it had never been real to begin with. The seeker felt tears forming in his eyes as he confronted this truth. But they were not tears of sadness. Exactly. They were tears of recognition, of seeing clearly perhaps for the first time. He didn't own his wife's love. She gave it freely and could withdraw it just as freely. The fact that she had chosen to give it for over 3 decades was a gift of staggering generosity, not an obligation she owed to his ownership. He thought of his children, now grown and living their own lives. How much energy he had spent when they were young trying to shape them, to mold them into the people he thought they should become. He had seen them as extensions of himself, as his legacy, as belonging to him in a profound way. But they had resisted that shaping, each in their own way, and had become their own people. People who surprised him, who made choices he wouldn't have made, who followed paths he hadn't anticipated. There had been pain in that, in watching them separate from him, in realizing he couldn't control their lives or protect them from all harm. But now, sitting in the darkness of this transformative night, he saw that pain had come from a false assumption, that they were his to control. They had never belonged to him. From the moment of their birth, they were their own beings on their own journey. He had been privileged to guide them for a time, to provide for them, to love them, but he had never owned them. And the love itself, that feeling he had for his children, for his wife, for his friends, did he own that? Could love be possessed? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that love was something that flowed through him, not something he contained or controlled. It arose spontaneously when conditions were right, couldn't be forced or manufactured. It came and went according to its own nature, like weather patterns or the changing of seasons. He had tried to hold on to love, to make it permanent and unchanging. When he felt it diminishing in a relationship, he would panic and try to recapture it, to force it back to its former intensity. But love, he now understood, was like water. The tighter you grasped it, the more it slipped through your fingers. It could only be experienced in the present moment, and then it transformed into something else, perhaps deeper and quieter, perhaps more distant, but always changing, always beyond his control. The seeker thought of friendships that had faded over the years despite his efforts to maintain them. He had felt betrayed by those losses, as if something that belonged to him had been stolen. But had those friendships ever been his? Or were they phenomena that arose when certain conditions were present, proximity, shared interests, complementary needs, and naturally dissolved when those conditions changed? He remembered a friend from college, someone he had been inseparable from for 4 years. They had promised to stay close forever, to be best men at each other's weddings, to grow old together comparing notes on life. But gradually, after graduation, they had drifted apart. Different cities, different careers, different life circumstances. The friendship hadn't ended in any dramatic way. It had simply evaporated. He had felt a sense of loss, of failure, as if he had done something wrong or hadn't tried hard enough. But now he saw that the friendship had been a beautiful temporary thing, perfect for the time and place in which it existed. It had never been his to keep. It had been a gift of circumstance, and when circumstances changed, the friendship changed with them. There was no failure in that, no betrayal. It was simply the nature of things to change, to arise and pass away according to conditions. The same was true of all his relationships. His colleagues at work, they were connected to him by the temporary condition of working at the same place. If he changed jobs, or they did, those relationships would transform or disappear. The bonds he felt with them, the sense of team and shared purpose, these were real in the moment but not permanent or ownable. Even family relationships, which seemed most permanent and inescapable, were subject to this same truth. His relationship with his siblings had changed dramatically over the decades. They had been companions in childhood, competitors in adolescence, strangers in early adulthood, and now in middle age, they were finding their way back to each other, but different, transformed by time and experience. The family bonds persisted in form, but their nature was constantly shifting, constantly evolving, responding to the changes in each person and in their circumstances. The seeker realized that he had been trying to freeze his relationships, to preserve them in amber like insects from another era, to own them in a particular configuration. But relationships were alive, and alive things must grow and change or die. His attempt to possess them, to keep them exactly as they were, had been a kind of violence against their nature. What would it mean to love without possessing? To appreciate people while they were present in his life without claiming ownership of them or their affections? To allow relationships to transform naturally, to come and go like seasons, without grief or grasping. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it removed the security he thought he had in these connections. If he didn't own these relationships, then they could be lost at any moment, and he would have no recourse, no claim to make. But liberating because it freed him from the exhausting work of trying to maintain and control something that was, by its nature, beyond control. He thought about the ways he had tried to possess the people in his life. The subtle manipulations, the expectations he held, the disappointment when people didn't behave according to his hopes. All of that came from an assumption of ownership, a belief that these people should be a certain way because they belonged to him, because they were his wife, his children, his friends. But they didn't belong to him. They belonged to themselves. And the love he felt for them, the connection he experienced, that was also not his. It was something larger, something that included him but wasn't contained by him. Love was like light passing through him, not originating from him or owned by him. As this understanding deepened, the seeker felt a profound shift in his chest, as if his heart was expanding, making room for a new way of being in relationship. He could love without grasping. He could appreciate without owning. He could enjoy connections while they lasted without demanding that they last forever. And when relationships changed or ended, he could feel the natural grief of that without the added suffering of feeling that something that belonged to him had been stolen. He stood and walked to the bedroom, looking at his wife sleeping peacefully, her face softened by sleep and moonlight. He felt a wave of tenderness so strong it almost brought him to his knees. But it was a different kind of love than he had known before. It wasn't possessive or demanding. It was simply a deep appreciation for this mysterious, sovereign being who had chosen to share her life with him. She was not his. She was herself. And that made the gift of her presence even more precious. Tomorrow, he thought, he would tell her this. He would release his claim of ownership and see what remained. He suspected it would be something deeper and truer than what he had known before, something that honored both of their freedoms and allowed for a connection based not on possession but on choice, renewed each day, each moment. The second category of ownership, relationships and love, had been examined and found to be, like his material possessions, ultimately beyond his grasp. People could not be owned. Love could not be captured. Connections arose and passed away according to their own nature. And in releasing his claim on them, he found he could appreciate them more fully, could be present to them without the anxiety of trying to make them permanent or control their evolution. Part 4. The third possession, time and memory. The seeker looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 in the morning. Hours had passed since he began this examination of ownership, but time seemed strange tonight, elastic, as if the normal rules didn't quite apply. This observation led him naturally to his next investigation. Time itself. Surely time was something he possessed? His time, his life, his days and hours and minutes? But even as he formulated the question, he began to see the answer emerging from the shadows of his understanding. Did he own time, or did time own him? He thought about all the ways he spoke about time. Spending time, wasting time, saving time, investing time. The language of ownership was everywhere in how he conceived of his temporal existence. This was his time to use as he saw fit. He made schedules, planned his days, allocated hours to various activities. He felt ownership of his time so completely that when others made demands on it, he felt robbed, as if something precious had been stolen from him. But what was time, really? Could it be possessed? Even as he sat here thinking these thoughts, time was flowing past him like a river, completely indifferent to his claims upon it. The minutes on the clock continued their march forward whether he wanted them to or not. The hours accumulated into days, the days into years, the years into a lifetime, and he had no control over this process whatsoever. He couldn't slow time down when he was enjoying something, no matter how much he wished to. He couldn't speed it up when he was suffering or bored. He couldn't save it up like money in a bank, storing hours from days when he had too much to use on days when he had too little. Time simply moved at its own pace in its own direction, and all he could do was move along with it. The seeker thought about his past, all those years he considered to be his life, his history, his story. But where were those years now? They were gone, vanished completely. They existed only as memories, and memories were themselves strange things. Not the actual past, but constructions of his mind, interpretations and reinterpretations, constantly being edited and revised. The past he remembered was not the past that had actually occurred. It was a story he told himself about what had occurred, and that story changed depending on his present mood, his current understanding, his ongoing process of making meaning from experience. He remembered a family vacation from 20 years ago. In his memory, it was a wonderful time, a highlight of his children's childhood. But when he had mentioned it to his daughter last year, she had remembered it very differently. She recalled being bored and homesick, missing her friends, frustrated with her younger brother. Same vacation, completely different experience, different memory. So whose memory was the true one? Or were both memories reconstructions that bore only a passing resemblance to the actual events? The more he thought about memory, the more unstable it seemed. Scientists had proven that each time you remember something, you're not accessing the original memory, but rather remembering the last time you remembered it. Memories were constantly being rewritten, updated, modified. They were more like stories that evolved with each telling than like photographs that accurately captured a moment. So if the past existed only as unreliable memory, did he own it? How could he possess something so fluid, so changeable, so fundamentally uncertain? His life story, which he considered one of his most personal possessions, was actually a kind of fiction, a narrative he had constructed from fragmentary and unreliable evidence. And even that narrative was beyond his complete control. Other people had their own versions of his story, their own memories of events he had participated in, and those versions often contradicted his own. And what about the future? He had always thought of his future as belonging to him, as something he was creating through his choices and actions. He made plans, set goals, imagined how things would unfold. But how many of those plans had actually come to fruition? How many goals had been achieved exactly as imagined? Very few. Life had a way of unfolding according to its own logic, shaped by countless factors beyond his control. Other people's choices, random events, shifts in circumstance, plain luck or its absence. The future he imagined was just that, imagined. It wasn't real. It was a projection, a hope, a fear, a fantasy. It existed only in his mind. And when the future became the present, it was almost always different from what he had imagined. So in what sense could he be said to own a future that existed only as speculation and that would inevitably be different from his expectations? That left only the present moment, this now that he was experiencing. Surely this belonged to him? This present moment was his, wasn't it? But as he tried to grasp the present moment, to hold it, to examine it, he found it was already gone, already transformed into the next moment. The present was infinitesimally thin, a mathematical point between the vanished past and the imagined future. By the time he became aware of a moment, it had already passed. The present was like trying to grab a handful of water. The act of grasping it caused it to slip away. And even this infinitesimal present moment, did it really belong to him? His experience of it was shaped by so many factors beyond his control. His conditioning, his biological state, his mood, his unconscious associations and reactions. The way he perceived and interpreted each moment was determined by a lifetime of experiences, by his genetic inheritance, by his culture, by countless influences he had never chosen and couldn't change. The seeker sat very still, trying to simply be present, to exist in the now without grasping it or trying to own it. What he found was that presence itself was effortless when he stopped trying to possess it. The moment simply was, and he was in it, and there was no need for ownership, no possibility of ownership. The present moment belonged to itself or to no one or to everyone equally. It was the ground of being, and he participated in it but didn't contain it or control it. He thought about all the time he had wasted or thought he had wasted, and realized that the concept of wasted time only made sense if he owned time to begin with. If time wasn't his, then it couldn't be wasted. It was just flowing as it always flowed, and he was doing whatever he was doing in it. Some activities brought him satisfaction, others didn't, but none of it was waste in any ultimate sense. It was all just the unfolding of life, the movement of time carrying him along like a leaf on a stream. The seeker had spent so much of his life anxious about time, worried he didn't have enough of it, stressed about using it efficiently, grieving over time lost or misspent. But all of that anxiety came from the illusion that time belonged to him, that he should be able to control it, allocate it, possess it. Releasing that illusion, he felt a lightness about time, a freedom to simply be in it without grasping it. He realized that the only relationship he could have with time was one of surrender. He couldn't own the past, which was gone and existed only as unreliable memory. He couldn't own the future, which was unknowable and existed only as imagination. He couldn't even own the present, which was too immediate, too evanescent to grasp. All he could do was allow time to flow through him, to live in it without claiming it, to experience each moment as it arose without trying to hold onto it or push it away. And his memories, those treasures he had polished and preserved, those stories he had told himself about who he was and what he had experienced, even these didn't belong to him. They arose in consciousness unbidden, transformed with each recollection, and would dissolve when consciousness itself dissolved at death. They were temporary phenomena, no more permanent or possessible than clouds in the sky. There was something deeply humbling about this realization, but also something freeing. If he didn't own his time, then he couldn't waste it. If he didn't own his past, then he wasn't bound by it. If he didn't own his future, then he couldn't fail to achieve it. He was simply here, now, alive in this moment, and that was enough. That was everything. The third category of ownership, time and memory, had revealed itself to be as illusory as the first two. Time couldn't be possessed because it couldn't be stopped or controlled. Memory couldn't be owned because it was fluid and unreliable. The past was gone, the future was imaginary, and the present was too immediate to grasp. All he could do was allow the river of time to carry him forward, present to each moment without claiming it, grateful for the experience without demanding permanence. Part 5. The fourth possession, knowledge and identity. As the night deepened toward its darkest hour before dawn, the seeker turned his attention to what he had always considered his most personal and inalienable possessions. His knowledge, his beliefs, his identity itself. Surely these belonged to him in a way that nothing else did. His thoughts, his understanding, his sense of who he was, these were his, weren't they? He had spent decades accumulating knowledge, filling his mind with facts, theories, perspectives, skills. He had degrees, certifications, expertise in various fields. He took pride in what he knew, in the depth and breadth of his understanding. His knowledge was his most portable possession, one that couldn't be taken from him by theft or disaster. It was his intellectual capital, his mental wealth. But as he sat in the darkness, the same questioning presence that had dismantled his other claims to ownership turned its attention to his knowledge. What did he actually know? And did he own that knowledge? He thought about the things he believed to be true, the facts he held in his mind. But where had they come from? He had learned them from teachers, from books, from experience. They had been passed to him by others, received from the vast accumulated knowledge of humanity. Even his own experiences and observations were interpreted through frameworks and concepts he had inherited from his culture, his language, his education. The words he used to think with, he hadn't invented them. The concepts that structured his understanding, he hadn't created them. The logical patterns his mind followed, they had been shaped by years of conditioning, training, cultural influence. In what sense could he claim ownership of thoughts that were constructed from borrowed materials, following borrowed patterns, structured by borrowed frameworks? The seeker tried to locate an original thought, something that was truly his creation, unprecedented and uninfluenced by anything external. But every thought he examined had roots in something he had learned, someone he had read, some experience that had shaped his perspective. His most creative ideas were combinations and recombinations of existing concepts. His insights were connections between knowledge that already existed in the world. There was nothing he could point to and say with certainty, "This thought is mine and mine alone." And even if he could identify an original thought, did he control when thoughts arose? He sat quietly and observed his mind. Thoughts appeared spontaneously, unbidden. He didn't decide what to think next. Thoughts simply arose from the mysterious depths of consciousness. He was more like a witness to his thoughts than their creator. They came and went like weather patterns, and he could no more control them than he could control the rain. Sometimes he tried to focus his mind, to think about a particular topic, to solve a problem. But even then, the solutions often came when he wasn't actively trying, when he was relaxed or distracted. His subconscious mind worked on problems without his conscious direction. Insights arrived unannounced, fully formed. He couldn't force understanding or manufacture wisdom. These things arose or they didn't according to their own timing. The seeker thought about beliefs he had held with absolute certainty at various points in his life, beliefs that he had later abandoned or revised. In his youth, he had believed certain things about politics, about human nature, about the way the world worked. Those beliefs had felt completely true at the time, as solid and unquestionable as the ground beneath his feet. But life had brought experiences that challenged those beliefs, exposed their limitations, revealed their partiality. He had changed his mind, not through conscious decision but through an accumulation of evidence and experience that made the old beliefs untenable. If his beliefs could change so dramatically, and if that change happened not through his conscious control but through the interaction of his mind with experience, then in what sense did he own those beliefs? They seemed to own him more than he owned them, shaping his perceptions, guiding his actions, filtering his experience, all without his conscious direction. And what about his identity, that most intimate sense of who he was? The seeker had always thought of his identity as his most essential possession. He was a particular person with particular characteristics, a history, a personality, a self that persisted through time and change. This self was the constant, the owner of all the other things he had thought he owned. But as he examined this self, this identity, it began to dissolve under scrutiny like salt in water. What was this self made of? Memories, but he had already determined that memories were fluid and unreliable. Thoughts, but thoughts arose and passed away constantly, beyond his control. Feelings, but emotions came and went like weather, responding to circumstances, biochemistry, unconscious associations. Beliefs, but these changed over time, shaped by experience and influence. His body, but every cell in his body had been replaced multiple times over his lifetime. The body he had now was not the body he was born with, and it would not be the body he would die with. So what remained that was permanent enough to constitute a self? What was the constant that he could point to and say, "This is me, this is mine"? The more he looked, the less he found. His personality traits had changed over the decades. The shy child had become a confident adult. The idealistic youth had become a pragmatic middle-aged man. The person he was now would be barely recognizable to his younger self. So which version was the true self? Or were they all temporary manifestations of something that was constantly changing, constantly being rebuilt from new materials and experiences? The seeker realized that his identity was more like a process than a thing, more like a river than a rock. A river has a name, we can point to it and recognize it, but the water that comprises it is constantly changing. You never step in the same river twice, the ancient philosophers said, because it's always different water. In the same way, he was never the same person from one moment to the next. His identity was a flowing pattern, a continuous process of becoming, not a fixed entity that could be owned or possessed. And this identity, this sense of self, it was constructed largely from stories he told about himself. I am a successful person. I am someone who values knowledge. I am a good father. I am an expert in my field. These stories created a coherent narrative that gave him a sense of continuity and meaning. But they were just that, stories, interpretations of experience, not experience itself. And different people who had witnessed his life would tell very different stories about who he was. His children might describe him as distant and preoccupied. His colleagues might describe him as brilliant and driven. His wife might describe him as both loving and emotionally unavailable. So which story was true? All of them? None of them? They were all partial, all limited perspectives on something too complex and multifaceted to be captured in any single narrative. His identity was not a possession but a multiplicity, a collection of perspectives and interpretations, constantly being negotiated and renegotiated in relationship with others and with his own evolving understanding. The seeker thought about the roles he played in life: husband, father, professional, friend, citizen. He had thought of these as aspects of his identity, parts of who he was. But they were really more like costumes he wore in different contexts, behaviors he performed according to social expectations and personal choices. At work, he was one person. At home, slightly different. With friends, different still. Which one was the real him? Or was there no real him beneath the roles, just the capacity to play various roles depending on the situation? This realization might have been terrifying, this dissolution of the solid self he had always believed in. But instead, the seeker found it strangely peaceful. If there was no fixed self to protect and defend, then there was no self that could be threatened or diminished. He was free to change, to grow, to become different without it being a betrayal of some essential identity. He was free to not know who he was, because there was no fixed answer to that question. His knowledge, his beliefs, his identity. All of these were like clouds, temporary formations arising from conditions, changing shape constantly, dissolving and reforming. They were phenomena he experienced, not possessions he owned. They moved through consciousness the way thoughts moved through the mind, appearing and disappearing according to their own nature. And what about consciousness itself, the awareness in which all of this appeared? Did he own his consciousness? Or was it more accurate to say that consciousness was the space in which he appeared, the ground in which the temporary formation he called self arose? Perhaps consciousness wasn't something he had but something he was, or something that included him but extended far beyond the boundaries of his personal identity. The seeker sat with these questions, not trying to answer them definitively but allowing them to work on his understanding like water working on stone, gradually reshaping the landscape of his mind. His knowledge was borrowed. His beliefs were conditional. His identity was fluid. His thoughts were spontaneous. Even his consciousness was mysterious, arising from he knew not where, sustained by he knew not what, destined to dissolve back into he knew not where. The fourth category of ownership, knowledge and identity, had revealed itself to be as impossible to possess as all the others. He couldn't own his thoughts because they arose unbidden. He couldn't own his knowledge because it was received from others and held in patterns not of his making. He couldn't own his beliefs because they changed in response to experience. He couldn't own his identity because it was a fluid process, not a fixed thing. And he couldn't even own his consciousness, which was the mysterious ground of all experiencing, beyond personal possession or control. With this realization, a profound question arose. If he couldn't own his thoughts, his knowledge, his beliefs, or his identity, then who or what was this he that was doing the examining? Was there an examiner at all, or just the process of examination itself, arising spontaneously in consciousness? Part 6. The fifth possession, the body itself. The seeker had examined his material possessions, his relationships, his time and memories, his knowledge and identity. Each had revealed itself to be beyond his ownership, temporary, ungraspable, not truly his despite all appearances and claims to the contrary. But surely there was one possession that was indisputably, fundamentally his body, this physical form that carried him through the world, that he inhabited, that responded to his will. Surely this was his most basic possession? He stood and walked to a mirror, looking at his reflection in the dim light before dawn. This was his body. He had been born with it, had lived in it for more than 5 decades, knew its quirks and limitations, its strengths and weaknesses. When he decided to raise his hand, the hand rose. When he chose to walk, the legs moved. There seemed to be a direct line of control from his will to his physical form. How could this not be his? But even as he looked at his reflection, doubts began to surface. This body had changed dramatically over the decades. The infant body he had begun with was completely gone, replaced cell by cell over the years. The child's body had given way to the adolescence, which had transformed into the adult's, which was now aging into the older body he saw in the mirror. Every 7 to 10 years, depending on the tissue type, most of his cells had been completely replaced. Was this the same body he had been born with, or a completely different one? The atoms that comprised him now were not the atoms he had been made of decades ago. And these atoms, where had they come from? From the food he ate, the water he drank, the air he breathed. His body was constantly exchanging matter with the world around him. He breathed in oxygen and breathed out carbon dioxide. He consumed nutrients and excreted waste. His body was not a closed system but an open one, constantly taking in material from the environment and releasing material back to it. The boundary between his body and the world was actually quite porous. The seeker thought about all the biological processes happening in his body at this moment without his conscious control or even awareness. His heart was beating, his lungs were breathing, his stomach was digesting, his cells were dividing and dying and being renewed, his immune system was fighting off pathogens, his neurons were firing in complex patterns that gave rise to thought and sensation. All of this was happening autonomously, beyond his will or control. Could he stop his heart from beating through sheer willpower? Could he command his cells to stop aging? Could he decide not to feel pain when he was injured? No. The body followed its own biological imperatives, its own genetic programming, its own response to the environment. He was more like a passenger in this body than its owner or controller. And what about when the body didn't obey his will? He thought about illness, the times when his body had failed him, when disease or injury had prevented it from functioning as he wished. During those times, the illusion of ownership had been particularly stark. He couldn't simply command his body to heal, to be well, to function properly. He had to submit to its limitations, work with its capacity for recovery, hope that its inherent healing mechanisms would succeed. As he aged, this lack of control had become more apparent. Things that had been easy in youth became difficult. Energy waned more quickly. Recovery took longer. The body was following its own timeline, its own trajectory toward decline and eventually death, and no amount of willpower could ultimately stop this process. He could influence it through diet, exercise, medical care, but he couldn't control it. The body had its own destiny, and he was subject to it. The seeker thought about death, the ultimate relinquishment of the body. When he died, where would this possession go? Back to the earth, to be broken down into its component parts, to be redistributed into the great cycle of matter and energy that comprised the physical universe. The atoms that currently formed his body would become part of other things, soil, plants, other living creatures. Nothing would be lost, but the particular configuration that he called his body would be dissolved. And even before death, parts of his body were constantly being shed and recycled. Every time he scratched an itch, thousands of dead skin cells fell away. Every time he exhaled, he released molecules that had been part of him. His hair and nails grew and were cut off, discarded. The boundary of the body was constantly being renegotiated, constantly shifting. He looked at his hand in the mirror, flexing the fingers. This hand that he thought of as his, it was really an incredibly complex system of bones, muscles, tendons, nerves, blood vessels, all working together in coordinated patterns established by millions of years of evolution. He didn't understand how his hand worked, didn't consciously control the contraction of individual muscle fibers or the firing of motor neurons. He simply had the intention to move, and the hand moved through mechanisms that were largely mysterious to him. In what sense did he own something he didn't fully understand and couldn't completely control? He was the beneficiary of the body's functioning, yes. He experienced the world through its senses, acted in the world through its capacities. But ownership implied a level of control and permanence that simply didn't match the reality of his relationship with the body. The seeker thought about consciousness and its relationship to the body. His awareness, his sense of being, seemed to be intimately connected to the body but also somehow separate from it. He could observe his body, feel sensations in it, but there was a quality of distance to this observation, as if consciousness was the space in which the body appeared rather than the body itself. He had assumed that consciousness was produced by the body, specifically by the brain. But was he certain of this? Consciousness was the one thing he knew directly and immediately. Everything else, including his knowledge of the brain and its functions, was known only through consciousness. In a strange way, consciousness was more fundamental than the body, more directly experienced, more primary. And yet, consciousness seemed to depend on the body. When the body was injured or impaired, consciousness was affected. When the brain was damaged, awareness was altered. When the body died, consciousness, at least as he knew it, apparently ceased. So the relationship was complex, intertwined, not easily divided into owner and owned. The seeker sat down again, feeling into his body, exploring the sensations that arose. Breathing, the slight pressure of his clothes against his skin, the cool air on his face, the subtle aches and tensions that were always present but usually unnoticed. These sensations arose in consciousness automatically. He didn't create them or control them. They simply appeared, moment by moment, a constant stream of information about the body's state and its interaction with the environment. Even these basic sensations, did he own them? Or were they just phenomena arising in consciousness, experienced but not possessed? Pain, pleasure, comfort, discomfort, they came and went according to conditions. He couldn't decide not to feel pain any more than he could decide not to see light or hear sound. The body generated these sensations and consciousness experienced them, but there was no ownership in the process, just the bare fact of experiencing. He thought about the breath, this most basic function that sustained life. He could influence his breathing, make it slower or faster, deeper or shallower. But he couldn't stop it entirely. The body would override his conscious control and force him to breathe. And most of the time, breathing happened without his conscious involvement at all, an automatic process managed by the brainstem. The breath breathed itself, moving in and out, sustaining life, independent of his will. In meditation traditions, the breath was often used as an object of awareness because it was both voluntary and involuntary, both controllable and autonomous. It was a perfect example of the ambiguous relationship between consciousness and the body, between will and automatic process. The seeker watched his breath now, feeling it move in and out, neither controlling it nor being controlled by it, just allowing it to be, observing it without claiming it. And in that observation, something shifted. The sense of ownership of this being his breath. His body began to relax. There was just breathing happening, just a body sitting, just sensations arising in consciousness. No one was owning these processes. They were simply occurring. And consciousness was simply aware of them occurring, without needing to claim them or control them. The body, the seeker realized, was like a vehicle he was borrowing for this lifetime. He didn't own it, he was using it. It had been assembled from materials that existed before him and would exist after him. It followed its own biological laws, its own trajectory of growth and decline. He could care for it, influence it to some degree, appreciate its capacities and work with its limitations. But he couldn't possess it any more than he could possess the air he breathed or the ground he walked on. And when he died, he would return this borrowed vehicle to the universe, its component parts to be recycled into new forms, new life. There was something both humbling and beautiful about this. He was not separate from the great cycle of matter and energy, not a soul trapped in flesh that it owned, but a temporary expression of the universe experiencing itself, a brief configuration of matter and consciousness that would arise, exist for a time, and then dissolve back into the source from which it came. The fifth and perhaps most fundamental category of ownership, the body itself, had revealed itself to be, like all the others, something he couldn't truly possess. It was changing constantly, controlled by biological processes beyond his will, destined to dissolve and return to the earth. He was its temporary inhabitant, not its owner, a guest in a house that would stand for a limited time before returning to the elements from which it was built. Part 7. The Great Revelation. As the first hints of light began to appear at the horizon, the seeker sat in profound silence. He had examined everything he had ever thought belonged to him. His possessions, his relationships, his time and memories, his knowledge and identity, even his body, and found that none of it was truly his. Everything was temporary, everything was borrowed, everything was beyond his ultimate control. The empire of ownership he had spent his life building had been revealed as a house of cards, an illusion maintained by habit and language and legal fiction and unexamined assumptions. And yet, strangely, he did not feel impoverished by this realization. He felt lighter, as if an enormous weight he had been carrying without knowing it had been set down. All the energy he had spent trying to protect and maintain and control his possessions, all of it could be released. There was nothing to protect because there was nothing to lose. There was nothing he could lose because there was nothing he had ever truly possessed. A profound peace began to settle over him, arising from somewhere deep within, or perhaps from everywhere at once. This peace was not the absence of problems or challenges. His life circumstances hadn't changed. He still lived in this house, had these relationships, occupied this aging body, possessed these legal documents that said certain things belonged to him. But his relationship to all of it had fundamentally transformed. The seeker understood now that ownership was a story, a useful fiction for organizing society and managing resources, but not an ultimate truth about reality. He could continue to use things, to care for relationships, to appreciate experiences, to maintain his body, all without the burden of thinking he owned them. He could hold everything lightly, grateful for its presence while it lasted, accepting of its departure when the time came. And in this acceptance, this release of grasping, he discovered a paradox that made him smile in the pre-dawn darkness. By giving up ownership of everything, he had, in a sense, gained everything. Not through possession, but through presence. Not through control, but through appreciation. The world was now his to experience fully without the anxiety of trying to keep it, without the fear of losing it, without the burden of maintaining it as a possession. He thought of a teaching he had heard long ago but never fully understood. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He had always interpreted this as praising humility or meekness, but now he saw it differently. The poor in spirit were those who recognized they owned nothing, who had released their claim on the world, who held everything lightly. And the kingdom of heaven was not some future reward, but the peace and freedom that came from this release, available right now in this moment. The seeker stood and walked to the window, watching the sky gradually lighten. The world was revealing itself in the growing light. Trees, hills, the valley below. None of it belonged to him, and yet all of it was his to witness, to appreciate, to be present to. The beauty of the dawn was not diminished by his inability to own it. If anything, it was enhanced. Because it was free, because it was itself, because it owed him nothing and demanded nothing from him, it could simply be beautiful, and he could simply witness that beauty without grasping it. He heard a bird begin to sing, its song pure and unself-conscious. The bird didn't sing because it owned the song or because the song belonged to it. It sang because singing was what it did, an expression of its nature, a response to the morning, a participation in the great symphony of life. The seeker felt a kinship with that bird, with all living things that participated in existence without claiming to own it. And he realized that this was what he could be now, not an owner but a participant, not a possessor but a witness, not a controller but a dancer in the great dance, moving with the rhythms of life, responding to its music, without demanding that the dance belong to him or that it conform to his will. All the things he had thought defined him, his wealth, his relationships, his achievements, his knowledge, his body, these were still present, still part of his experience. But they were no longer his identity. They were phenomena arising in consciousness, temporary expressions of the great unfolding of existence. He could appreciate them, work with them, be changed by them without needing to possess them. The seeker thought about what this would mean for how he lived. He would continue to work, to earn money, to purchase things he needed or wanted. But he would hold his possessions lightly, knowing they were temporary, knowing they didn't define his worth or identity. He would enjoy them while they lasted and release them without grief when they departed, whether through loss or through his own choice to give them away. He would continue to love his wife, his children, his friends, but he would love them as sovereign beings, not as possessions. He would appreciate their presence without demanding that they stay the same, without needing them to fulfill his expectations, without grasping at them when they grew or changed or moved away. His love could be freer, more generous, less constrained by fear and need. He would continue to live in time, to have a past and anticipate a future. But he would hold his memories lightly, knowing they were reconstructions, stories that evolved with each telling. He would make plans for the future without being attached to them, knowing that life would unfold according to its own logic. And most importantly, he would try to stay present to the now, this moment that was all he ever really had, this eternal present in which all of life actually occurred. He would continue to learn, to think, to hold beliefs and opinions. But he would hold them provisionally, knowing that understanding evolved, that beliefs changed, that the map was not the territory. He would be open to new information, willing to change his mind, curious rather than certain. His identity could be fluid, responding to experience, growing and transforming without it being a crisis or a loss of self. And he would continue to inhabit this body, to care for it and work with it and eventually to die in it. But he would treat it as a temporary home, a borrowed vehicle, appreciating its capacities without demanding that it be other than it was, accepting its limitations without resentment, knowing that one day he would return it to the earth from which it came. The seeker realized that this night had been a death of sorts, a death of the ego that claimed ownership, a death of the self that thought it could possess the world. But it was also a birth of a freer way of being, a lighter way of moving through life, a more authentic relationship with reality. He had died to ownership and been born into participation. He had died to control and been born into presence. He had died to grasping and been born into appreciation. And the most beautiful thing, the thing that made his eyes fill with tears of gratitude and wonder, was that nothing external had to change for this transformation to occur. The world was exactly as it had been. His circumstances were unchanged, but his relationship to all of it was completely different. He had been liberated not by changing his life, but by changing his understanding, not by gaining new possessions, but by releasing his claim to the ones he thought he had. The sun broke over the horizon, flooding the valley with light, and the seeker laughed out loud. A pure, joyful laugh that came from somewhere deep within. He had spent his entire life seeking, and now he had found what he was looking for. Not by acquiring it, not by achieving it, not by earning it, but by releasing his grip on everything else. The truth had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for him to see it. Nothing belongs to him, and that was the most liberating truth he had ever encountered. He understood now why spiritual traditions spoke of enlightenment as a burden being lifted, as a knot being untied, as a prisoner being freed. The burden was the weight of ownership. The knot was the tangle of grasping and fear. The prison was the belief that he needed to possess things in order to be complete, to be safe, to be himself. And freedom, true freedom, came not from having everything but from needing nothing, from wanting nothing to be other than it was, from accepting the fundamental impermanence and ungraspability of all phenomena. This freedom was available to everyone, always, regardless of their circumstances, because it wasn't dependent on external conditions. It was a shift in understanding, a release of a false belief, a simple seeing of what had always been true. Part 8. Integration. Living with nothing. The sun had fully risen now, and the seeker heard his wife stirring in the bedroom. Soon the day would begin with its routines and responsibilities, its demands and opportunities. But he knew that this day would be different from all the days that had come before, because he was different. The transformation that had occurred during the night was not something that could be reversed or forgotten. It had changed the fundamental orientation of his being. He made coffee, moving through the familiar motions of the morning routine, but experiencing them with fresh awareness. The coffee beans had been grown somewhere far away, picked and processed and roasted and shipped, passing through many hands to arrive in his kitchen. He didn't own this coffee. He was its temporary recipient, fortunate to be the one who got to experience its rich aroma and complex flavor. The cup he poured it into was made of ceramic, formed from clay pulled from the earth, shaped and fired by craftspeople he would never meet. He was borrowing this cup for a time, just as he was borrowing this body, this life, this moment. His wife appeared in the kitchen, looking at him with mild curiosity. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep?" The seeker smiled at her, seeing her perhaps for the first time in years. Really seeing her, not as his wife, not as fulfilling a role in his life, but as a mysterious, sovereign being who had chosen to share her journey with his, who graced him with her presence each day, who owed him nothing and yet gave him everything. The love he felt for her in that moment was overwhelming in its purity, uncomplicated by need or expectation or fear of loss. "I've been thinking," he said. "Actually, I've been having the most extraordinary night. I've realized something important, something that changes everything." She poured herself coffee and sat down, giving him her attention. And he tried to explain what he had discovered, knowing that words would be inadequate but wanting to share this gift with her, this liberation that had come to him in the darkness. He told her about examining his possessions and realizing they were temporary, that his ownership of them was an illusion. He told her about understanding that relationships couldn't be possessed, that people were sovereign beings who could only be appreciated, not owned. He told her about time slipping through his fingers, about memories being fluid, about identity being a process rather than a fixed thing. He told her about the body being borrowed matter, about consciousness being a mystery he participated in but couldn't control. She listened quietly, sipping her coffee, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "So you've discovered you own nothing. What are you going to do about it?" It was a practical question, very much like her, and it made him smile. "I'm going to live," he said, "but differently. I'm going to hold everything lightly. I'm going to appreciate without grasping. I'm going to love without possessing. I'm going to participate without controlling. I'm going to be present without demanding permanence." "That sounds beautiful," she said. "But how? How do you actually do that in the middle of regular life, with bills to pay and responsibilities to meet and problems to solve?" It was a good question, maybe the most important question. The insight was one thing. Integrating it into daily life was another. The seeker thought about this. "I think," he said slowly, "it means doing everything I was doing before, but with a different intention, a different relationship to it. I'll still work, but not to possess more. I'll still care for our home, but knowing it's temporary. I'll still love you and our children, but without the grasping that tries to keep you from changing or growing. I'll still make plans, but holding them lightly, ready to adapt when life unfolds differently than expected." "And when things go wrong?" she asked. "When you lose something you care about, when someone you love leaves or dies, when your body fails you, won't this philosophy make those losses unbearable, knowing that you never really had any of it to begin with?" The seeker considered this. It was true that loss was inevitable. Nothing lasted forever. Everything he valued would eventually change or end. But he realized that the suffering he had experienced from loss in the past had come not from the loss itself but from the belief that he owned what was lost, that it should have remained his, that he had a right to keep it. The grief was natural and would still come, but it would be cleaner, purer, without the added suffering of resistance, without the feeling of violation or injustice. "I think," he said, "that accepting impermanence doesn't make loss hurt less, but it makes the hurt cleaner. It's the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is what happens when we lose something we care about. It's natural, human, unavoidable. But suffering is what we add to pain when we resist it, when we demand that reality be other than it is, when we cling to what's already gone. I can't avoid pain, but I can reduce suffering by accepting that everything is temporary, that loss is part of life, that nothing was ever truly mine to keep." His wife nodded slowly. "I think I understand," she said. "It's like the Buddhist teaching about attachment being the root of suffering." "Yes," the seeker said, "but I'm only just beginning to understand what that really means. It's not about being cold or indifferent. It's about loving fully while knowing that what you love is already in the process of leaving, has always been leaving. It's about cherishing the present without grasping at it, without trying to freeze it in time." They sat together in comfortable silence, drinking their coffee as the morning light grew stronger. The seeker felt a deep peace, but also a slight anxiety about whether he could maintain this understanding, whether the insights of the night would survive contact with the challenges of daily life. It was one thing to have a profound realization in the quiet darkness of a sleepless night. It was another thing to live from that realization when stress and difficulty arose. As if reading his thoughts, his wife said, "You know you'll forget this sometimes. You'll get caught up in things, start grasping again, fall back into old patterns. That's okay. That's being human." She was right, of course. The seeker didn't expect perfection or permanent enlightenment. He would forget, would grasp, would fall back into the illusion of ownership. But now he had a reference point, a remembered experience of freedom that he could return to. When he noticed himself grasping, trying to control, suffering from the belief that something belonged to him, he could remember this night, could remember the truth he had discovered, could release his grip and return to presence. The practice, he realized, was not to achieve some permanent state of non-attachment, but to keep remembering, keep releasing, keep returning to the truth of impermanence and non-ownership. It was a practice that would last the rest of his life, a constant remembering and forgetting and remembering again. Over the following days and weeks, the seeker experimented with living from this new understanding. He noticed how often his language reflected the illusion of ownership. My car, my house, my ideas, my time. He began to notice the subtle grasping behind these words, the way they created a sense of self that was defined by possessions and relationships and achievements. He experimented with different language, different ways of relating to things. Instead of my house, he tried thinking of it as the house I live in. Instead of my ideas, he thought of them as ideas that have arisen. Instead of my time, he thought of it as time that I'm experiencing. The changes were subtle, but they shifted something in his consciousness, loosened the grip of ownership. He found that he could appreciate things more fully when he wasn't trying to possess them. A sunset was more beautiful when he wasn't trying to capture it or keep it, when he could simply be present to it as it unfolded and faded. A conversation was more meaningful when he wasn't trying to control where it went or make sure his point was heard. A meal was more satisfying when he wasn't thinking about whether it was worth what he paid for it. He also found that he could let things go more easily. When an expensive vase his mother had given him broke, he felt a moment of sadness, but not the anger and sense of violation he might have felt before. It was just a vase, just a temporary configuration of matter that had served its purpose and now was transforming into something else. In this case, fragments headed for a landfill. The memory of his mother and the love she had expressed in giving him the vase remained, even though the physical object was gone. When a long-term client decided to work with someone else, he felt disappointment, but not the personal offense he might have felt before. The client was making a choice based on their needs and circumstances. The relationship had been good while it lasted, and now it was changing form. There was no ownership, no betrayal, no theft, just the natural evolution of things. When his adult daughter told him she was moving to another country for a job opportunity, he felt the pull of wanting to keep her close, the old instinct to possess, to control, to keep his family together in the configuration he was comfortable with. But he recognized this as grasping, as trying to own someone who had never belonged to him. He blessed her journey, celebrated her courage, and let her go with genuine joy for her adventure, even though it meant seeing her less often. The seeker found that this new way of being affected every aspect of his life. In his work, he became less attached to specific outcomes, which paradoxically made him more effective. He could propose ideas without defensive investment in them, could receive criticism without feeling personally attacked, could collaborate more genuinely because he wasn't trying to get credit or establish ownership of concepts. In his relationships, he became more present and less demanding. He listened without waiting for his turn to speak. He allowed people to be who they were without needing them to conform to his expectations. He gave advice only when asked and held his opinions lightly. Relationships deepened as the grasping fell away, as people felt the freedom to be themselves in his presence. In his spiritual life, which had always been somewhat theoretical, he found a new authenticity. He wasn't seeking enlightenment or accumulating spiritual knowledge or trying to achieve some special state. He was simply practicing presence, practicing release, practicing acceptance of what is. The great spiritual truths he had read about in books became lived experiences, verified in his own direct experience. Part 9. Philosophical Reflections. As the seeker integrated his realization into daily life, he found himself drawn to ancient wisdom traditions that had been pointing toward these same truths for millennia. He had read many of these texts before, but they had been mere words, intellectual concepts. Now they came alive with meaning, resonating with his direct experience. The Buddhist teaching of anatta, non-self, which had always seemed abstract or even nihilistic, now made perfect sense. There was no permanent, unchanging self that could own anything because the self itself was a process, a flow, a temporary pattern arising from conditions. The clinging to a permanent self and to permanent possessions that belonged to that self was indeed the root of suffering, just as the Buddha had taught. The Buddhist concept of anicca, impermanence, was not a pessimistic observation about the fleeting nature of joy, as he had sometimes thought, but a liberating truth. Because everything was impermanent, everything was fresh, new, constantly being born and dying. The impermanence that made possession impossible also made each moment precious and unique. He would never experience this exact moment again, which made it infinitely valuable precisely because it couldn't be kept. The teaching of sunyata, emptiness, which had always confused him, now revealed its meaning. Things were empty not in the sense of being nothing, but empty of inherent, independent existence. Everything arose from causes and conditions, was made up of parts that were themselves made up of parts, was constantly changing and in relationship with everything else. There was no solid, graspable essence to anything, including himself. And this emptiness, far from being nihilistic, was the ground of freedom and compassion. Because nothing existed independently, everything was intimately connected. Because nothing could be grasped, everything could be appreciated. The seeker turned to the Tao Te Ching and found similar wisdom expressed differently. When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. When I let go of what I have, I receive what I need. This paradox that had seemed like wordplay now revealed itself as practical truth. By releasing his claim to identity and possession, he had indeed become more than he was before, not diminished but expanded, not impoverished but enriched. Lao Tzu's teaching that the wise man does not hoard, and the more he gives to others, the more he has for himself made perfect sense now. When you didn't grasp, when you held things lightly and gave freely, there was no sense of loss or depletion. The giving and receiving became part of the same flow, like breathing in and breathing out. Hoarding came from the illusion that things could be permanently kept, that security came from accumulation. But real security, real wealth, came from knowing that everything was already flowing, already being given and received, and that you could participate in that flow without fear. He discovered similar teachings in Stoic philosophy. Epictetus's distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us suddenly clarified. Our thoughts, judgments, and intentions were in our control, though even this, the seeker realized, was limited. But external events, other people's actions, the outcomes of our efforts, even our own bodies, these were not ultimately in our control. Suffering came from trying to control what couldn't be controlled, from attaching ourselves to outcomes we couldn't guarantee, from claiming ownership of things that were not ours to own. Marcus Aurelius's meditations on impermanence, his reminders to himself that everything passes, that nothing lasts, that we are all temporary visitors to this world. These were not morbid fixations but practices of liberation. By remembering that he would die, that everyone he loved would die, that everything he valued would eventually end, he could hold everything more lightly, appreciate everything more fully, waste less time on trivial concerns. In the Christian tradition, which he had been raised in but had drifted away from, he found new depth in Jesus's teaching about the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. This wasn't about being passive or irresponsible. It was about trusting the process of life, about not being consumed by anxiety about the future, about understanding that grasping and hoarding came from a lack of faith in the abundant, flowing nature of existence. The teaching to lay up treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, now made sense not as a promise of afterlife rewards, but as an invitation to value what couldn't be destroyed because it couldn't be possessed in the first place. Love, wisdom, presence, connection, beauty. These were treasures that didn't need to be guarded or hoarded because they were inexhaustible and couldn't be stolen. He saw the teaching about the rich young ruler in a new light. Jesus hadn't told him to give away his possessions because wealth was evil, but because his attachment to his possessions, his belief that they belonged to him and defined him, was preventing him from experiencing true freedom and entering the kingdom of heaven, which was available right now, not in some future afterlife, but only to those who had released their grasping. In the Hindu tradition, he found the same teaching expressed through the concept of Maya, the illusory nature of the phenomenal world. This didn't mean that the world wasn't real, but that our perception of it as solid, permanent, graspable was an illusion. Seeing through Maya didn't mean rejecting the world, but seeing it clearly, understanding its true nature as flowing, impermanent, ungraspable. The Bhagavad Gita's teaching about performing actions without attachment to their fruits took on new meaning. It wasn't about being indifferent to outcomes, but about doing what needed to be done without grasping at results, without defining yourself by success or failure, without claiming ownership of outcomes that were determined by countless factors beyond your control. You could act fully, even passionately, while holding the results lightly. The seeker was struck by how these diverse traditions, arising in different times and places and cultures, all pointed toward the same fundamental truth. Grasping causes suffering, and release brings freedom. They used different languages, different metaphors, different practices, but the core insight was universal. It wasn't a cultural artifact or a philosophical opinion, but a description of how consciousness worked, how reality was structured, how human flourishing became possible. And this truth wasn't just ancient wisdom. It was being confirmed by modern science as well. Quantum physics had revealed that at the most fundamental level, matter was not solid stuff but patterns of energy and probability. The solid, graspable reality of everyday experience was in some sense an illusion, a construction of perception. Nothing was as solid as it appeared. Everything was in constant flux, arising from fields of possibility. Psychology had shown that the self was not a fixed entity but a narrative construction, constantly being revised and rebuilt from memory and experience. The ownership of possessions activated the same brain regions as the sense of self, suggesting that what we owned was being incorporated into our identity. Letting go of possessions, then, wasn't just giving up objects but releasing aspects of our constructed self-image. Neuroscience had revealed that the brain's predictive processing was constantly creating models of reality, and that these models often diverged from reality itself. Our sense of control, of ownership, of being a unified self, these were narratives the brain constructed, useful fictions that helped us navigate the world but not accurate descriptions of what was actually happening. The letting go that the seeker had experienced was, in some sense, seeing past these constructed narratives to a more direct experience of reality. Ecology had shown that the boundary between self and world was porous and interdependent. The atoms that made up his body had been cycled through countless organisms. The oxygen he breathed had been produced by plants and algae. The food he ate connected him to global networks of agriculture, commerce, and ecology. The idea of an independent, separate self that could own things in isolation from this vast web of interconnection was revealed as a kind of useful fiction, necessary for practical purposes but not ultimately true. The seeker realized that his insight wasn't special or unique. It wasn't something he had discovered through exceptional intelligence or spiritual prowess. It was a basic truth about reality that had been observed and taught by wise people throughout history and was being confirmed by contemporary science. The question wasn't whether it was true, it obviously was, but why it remained so difficult for people, himself included, to live from this truth. He thought about the evolutionary and psychological reasons for the illusion of ownership. Creating a sense of self, of ownership, of control, these were adaptive strategies that helped humans survive and thrive. In a world of scarcity and competition, those who defended their resources and their kin were more likely to pass on their genes. The brain's tendency to create a unified narrative self, to construct a sense of ownership and control, was a feature, not a bug, from an evolutionary perspective. But what had been adaptive in the ancestral environment might not be optimal for well-being in the modern world. The grasping that helped humans survive in resource-scarce environments now caused suffering in a world of relative abundance. The sense of ownership that helped defend against competitors now prevented the experience of interconnection and flow. The constructed self that provided coherence and agency now constrained growth and transformation. The spiritual path, then, was in some sense working against evolutionary programming, seeing through adaptive illusions to a deeper truth. This was why it required practice, why the insights had to be remembered again and again, why the default state was to fall back into grasping and the illusion of ownership. The brain was doing what it had evolved to do, and choosing to live from a different understanding required conscious effort and repeated practice. Part 10. The journey continues. Months had passed since that transformative night. The seeker had integrated his realization into daily life to the degree he was able, which meant imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely. There were days when he lived from the truth of non-ownership, holding everything lightly, appreciating, without grasping. And there were days when he forgot completely, when he got caught up in stress and worry, when he grasped at control, when he suffered from the belief that things should be other than they were. But even forgetting had become part of the practice. When he noticed he was grasping, suffering, trying to possess and control, he could pause, remember, and release. The forgetting and remembering created a rhythm, a cycle that gradually deepened his understanding and made the periods of release longer and the periods of grasping shorter. He had started a daily meditation practice, something he had always meant to do but had never found time for. Now he saw it not as adding something to his schedule, but as practicing the essential art of being present without grasping, of observing without owning. He would sit each morning, watching thoughts arise and pass away, watching sensations come and go, watching the breath move in and out, not trying to control any of it, just allowing it to be. In this practice, he discovered that the mind's tendency to grasp was incredibly persistent and subtle. He would start to watch the breath, and within moments would find himself planning his day, rehashing a conversation, worrying about a problem. He would notice this, gently return to the breath, and within moments would be lost in thought again. But gradually, the moments of presence became more frequent, the grip of thought loosened, and he developed a capacity to observe the mind's activity without being completely identified with it. He noticed patterns in his grasping. There were certain triggers: stress at work, conflict in relationships, physical discomfort, boredom, that would reliably activate the old patterns of trying to control, to fix, to grasp. He became curious about these patterns, studying them with the same attention he had once brought to business problems. What was the underlying fear? What was the belief driving the grasping? What would happen if he didn't try to control the situation? Sometimes he experimented with not grasping, with just being present to difficulty without trying to fix it immediately. He discovered that most problems either resolved themselves or became easier to address when he approached them from presence rather than from anxious grasping. The space that opened up when he stopped trying to control allowed for creative solutions, for acceptance of what couldn't be changed, for connection with others who were struggling with similar challenges. The seeker's relationships had deepened in unexpected ways. With his wife, there was a new tenderness and respect. He had apologized for the ways he had tried to possess her, to control her, to make her conform to his expectations. He had told her about his realization and his ongoing practice, and she had shared her own experiences of feeling trapped by his need for control. They had begun to relate to each other more as partners in a shared journey than as possessions in each other's lives. With his children, there was more spaciousness. He could be genuinely interested in their choices without needing those choices to reflect well on him or to conform to his vision of what their lives should be. He could support them in their struggles without trying to fix everything for them. He could love them without the grasping that had sometimes made his love feel more like a burden than a gift. He had even begun to change how he worked. Success and failure, which had once defined his sense of self-worth, became less charged. He could pursue goals with genuine energy and commitment while holding the outcomes lightly. He could take appropriate risks because he wasn't so afraid of loss. He could collaborate more genuinely because he wasn't always trying to get credit or protect his territory. Paradoxically, as he cared less about success in the conventional sense, he became more successful. The release of grasping made him more creative, more present, more responsive to opportunities. People wanted to work with him because they felt his authentic engagement without the desperate need to prove himself or accumulate more achievements. But the journey was far from complete, and the seeker knew it never would be. He still got caught in old patterns. He still suffered from grasping. He still forgot the truth he had discovered that night and had to keep remembering it again and again. There was a particularly difficult period when his company went through a reorganization and his position was eliminated. All the old fears rose up, fears about financial security, about his identity and worth, about his ability to provide for his family. For weeks, he was consumed by anxiety, grasping at control, trying to fix the situation, suffering from the belief that this shouldn't be happening, that he should still have what he had lost. But eventually, the practice kicked in. He remembered to pause, to breathe, to notice the grasping and the suffering it created. He remembered that he didn't own his job, had never owned it. It had been a role he played for a time, and now that time was over. His worth wasn't determined by his employment status. His identity wasn't defined by his position. He was still here, still breathing, still present to this moment. With this release, the anxiety didn't completely disappear, but it became workable. He could take practical steps to find new work without the added suffering of resistance and grasping. He could be present to his family's concerns without being overwhelmed by them. He could even see the situation as an opportunity, a chance to reassess what he really wanted to do, to make changes he had been too afraid to make while comfortable in his old position. Eventually, he found new work that was actually more aligned with his values than his old job had been. The reorganization that had seemed like a disaster had opened a door that he might never have walked through otherwise. But the seeker knew this was not the point of the story. The point was not that everything worked out well in the end. The point was that he had found a way to be present to difficulty without adding unnecessary suffering through grasping and resistance. He had also experienced loss that didn't work out so neatly. A dear friend had died suddenly. The grief was profound, visceral, overwhelming at times. But it was clean grief, natural grief, the pain of love confronting the reality of death. There was no added suffering from the belief that this shouldn't have happened, that he should still have his friend, that something that belonged to him had been stolen. His friend had never belonged to him. They had shared time together, had influenced each other, had loved each other. And now his friend was gone, and the love remained, and the influence remained, and the memories remained, even though the physical presence was gone. The seeker found that he could grieve fully, allow the pain to move through him in waves, honor his friend's memory, all while accepting the fundamental truth of impermanence. Death was not a violation of some cosmic law that guaranteed he could keep what he loved. It was the natural completion of a life, the return of borrowed elements to the universe, the inevitable conclusion of everything that begins. In his grief, he discovered a deeper connection to all of humanity, to everyone who had ever lost someone they loved, to the universal experience of impermanence and death. His personal loss connected him to something larger, something that included all loss, all grief, all the tenderness and tragedy of human life. And in that connection, paradoxically, he found a kind of comfort. The practice continued, day by day, moment by moment. The seeker kept sitting in meditation each morning, kept remembering to release his grip when he noticed it tightening, kept returning to presence when he found himself lost in thought. He read more of the wisdom traditions, finding support and instruction in the words of those who had walked this path before him. He also found community with others who were engaged in similar practice. A local meditation group became a weekly refuge, a place to sit in silence with others who understood the challenge and the importance of releasing grasping. In sharing his experience with others and hearing theirs, he discovered that the journey was both deeply personal and completely universal. Everyone struggled with the same basic patterns of grasping and suffering, and everyone could access the same basic freedom of release. The seeker began to notice subtle changes in his consciousness, changes that were hard to describe but unmistakable in their impact. There was more space between stimulus and response, more freedom to choose how to relate to experience rather than automatically reacting from conditioning. There was a fundamental okayness with being, a basic trust in the process of life that remained even when circumstances were difficult. He noticed that his sense of self was less rigid, less defended, more permeable. He could take in feedback and criticism without it threatening his identity. He could admit ignorance or error without it diminishing his worth. He could change his mind without it being a betrayal of who he was. The self that had once seemed so solid and important was revealing itself to be a flexible, optional construct that could be held lightly. And perhaps most significantly, he noticed a deepening capacity for love that wasn't based on need or grasping. He could love people without needing them to love him back, without needing them to be a certain way, without needing anything from them. This love was more like an open channel, allowing love to flow through rather than trying to capture it or direct it or own it. It was simultaneously less personal and more universal, less about specific attachments and more about a basic warmth toward existence itself. Part 11. Closing, an invitation to sleep. The voice becomes softer, slower, more rhythmic, designed to guide the listener towards sleep. And now, dear listener, as our story comes to a close, I invite you to bring its wisdom into your own rest. The seeker's journey through that transformative night is also your journey. The truth he discovered is available to you as well. You don't need to own anything to be complete. You don't need to grasp anything to be whole. You are already enough, already perfect in your imperfection, already participating fully in the great mystery of existence. As you prepare to sleep, begin to release your grip on the day that has passed. All the things you did or didn't do, all the words you spoke or wished you had spoken, all the moments of success and moments you perceived as failure, let them go. They belong to the past now, which exists only as memory, which is already fading like a dream upon waking. You don't need to hold on to any of it. It's already gone, already flowing back into the stream of time from which it arose. Release your grip on tomorrow as well. All the plans you've made, all the worries about what might happen, all the hopes and fears about the future, set them down. Tomorrow doesn't exist yet. It's just imagination, just speculation, just stories you're telling yourself. The actual tomorrow, when it arrives, will be different from anything you imagine, will be shaped by countless factors beyond your control. So there's no need to grasp at it now. Let it be unknown. Let it be free to unfold as it will. Let go of your possessions, those objects you think of as yours. They're just temporarily in your care, just passing through your life as you pass through theirs. They don't define you, don't determine your worth, don't need to be protected or worried over as you sleep. They're safe in their own existence, independent of your claims upon them. You can release your ownership and simply trust that what you need will be available when you need it. Let go of relationships, of trying to hold on to people or control their thoughts or feelings about you. The people in your life are sovereign beings on their own journeys. They're connected to you now through invisible threads of affection and shared history, but those connections are alive, dynamic, changing. You don't need to grasp at them. Trust that the connections that are meant to remain will remain in whatever form serves the highest good. Trust that people can be free and you can still love them. Release your identity, that story you tell yourself about who you are. You're not your achievements, not your failures, not your roles or your reputation or your past or your plans for the future. You're not even your body, which is just borrowed matter destined to return to the earth. You're something more mysterious, more fundamental, a capacity for awareness, a window through which the universe observes itself, a temporary aperture of consciousness through which life flows. And even consciousness itself, that most intimate sense of being, you don't need to grasp at it. Is here now, aware of these words, aware of your breath, aware of the sensations in your body as it settles into rest. But it doesn't belong to you any more than the air you breathe belongs to you. It's something you participate in, something that includes you but extends beyond you, something vast and mysterious that you can rest in without needing to understand or control. Feel your body now sinking into whatever surface supports you. Notice the pull of gravity, the earth holding you, supporting you without any effort on your part. You don't need to hold yourself up, don't need to maintain control. You can completely surrender to gravity, trusting that the earth will continue to support you as it has supported countless beings throughout all of time. Notice your breath, moving in and out without your conscious direction. The breath knows how to breathe you. The body knows how to heal itself, to maintain itself, to move through the cycles of waking and sleeping without requiring your management. You can trust these automatic processes, can release control, can allow the body to do what it knows how to do. Feel your thoughts beginning to slow, to scatter, to lose their grip on your attention. Thoughts that seemed so important an hour ago are already fading, already becoming transparent. You don't need to think right now. You don't need to solve any problems, make any decisions, figure anything out. All of that can wait. For now, you can just be breathing and resting and allowing sleep to come in its own time. If thoughts arise, and they will because that's what thoughts do, you don't need to engage with them. Just notice them, like clouds passing through the sky of awareness, and let them pass. They're not your thoughts in the sense that you own them. They're just thoughts arising in consciousness, and they'll dissolve on their own if you don't feed them with attention. The The same with any emotions that might be present. Worry, sadness, anxiety, excitement. Whatever is there, you can let it be. You don't need to push it away, don't need to indulge it. Just acknowledge it, give it space, and allow it to move through. Emotions are like weather patterns, arising from conditions, changing moment by moment. You can be the sky in which the weather happens, vast and accommodating and unchanged by what passes through. And notice that even without trying to own anything, without grasping at any experience, without claiming anything as yours, you're still here, aware, present, being. This basic awareness doesn't depend on ownership, doesn't require control, doesn't need anything to be other than it is. It's already complete, already perfect, already at rest. From this place of rest, this place of release, sleep can come naturally. Not because you're trying to sleep, not because you've achieved some special state, but simply because you've stopped resisting, stopped grasping, stopped trying to control the natural rhythms of your body and mind. Sleep is what happens when you let go, when you trust the process, when you surrender to the darkness that holds you. So let yourself drift now. There's nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to do, nothing you need to be except what you already are. The seeker spent a night discovering that nothing belonged to him and found freedom in that realization. You can discover the same freedom now, in this moment, as you release your grip on wakefulness and allow sleep to claim you. You are not diminished by owning nothing. You are liberated. You are not impoverished by letting go of everything. You are enriched. You are not lost when you release your identity. You are found. You are not alone when you stop trying to possess relationships. You are connected to everything. In sleep, you'll let go of even consciousness itself for a time, trusting that it will return when morning comes, trusting in the cycles that have carried life through billions of years, trusting in the vast intelligence that animates existence and requires nothing from you except your willingness to participate, to allow, to be. So rest now. Sleep now. Let everything go. Release your grip on the day, on tomorrow, on your possessions and relationships and identity and even your body. Let yourself dissolve into sleep like a wave dissolving into the ocean, returning to the source from which you arose, resting in the great mystery that holds all things. Nothing belongs to you, and that is the most beautiful truth. Because in owning nothing, grasping at nothing, claiming nothing, you are free. Free to rest, free to sleep, free to be exactly as you are in this moment, complete and whole and already home. Sleep well, dear friend. The universe holds you. The night embraces you. And in the morning, when you wake, you'll still be here, still breathing, still participating in this extraordinary gift of existence. But for now, for these precious hours of darkness, rest. Release. Let go. Let go. Let go. Sleep.